Their bravado melts under reality. Their spin collapses under questions, and I've got plenty of them. Let's get into it.
This is the Republican hypocrisy parade at its finest. A senator grandstanding about the Constitution while defending the exact cruelty it forbids. You won't believe the intellectual gymnastics on display.
Senator Merkley.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you very much, Director Patel. And so, as I understood it, you testified yesterday that you'd like to have another $1 billion added on to the FY25 level to do the additional work you'd like to do on drug interdiction, fentanyl in general, and anti-terrorism. And today you gave us a budget that requests cutting $500 million. Which is it? Do you want us to, what are you asking of this committee? To add funds, add $1 billion, or to cut $500 million?
Thank you, Senator. Appreciate the opportunity. What I'm asking for is that with more, I can simply do more. And I was giving examples of what more I could do. I can do the mission and am in support of the budget here, and I'm working with appropriators and you to fill the gaps.
So you support the budget presented that cuts $500 million, but you also support us adding $1 billion should we choose to do that?
Well, I can't not support the budget as proposed because then I would be supporting no budget.
Okay. Well, we've got those two options. We do look forward to further details from you about how you plan to modify the function of FBI on these different missions that you've highlighted today so that we can give it the appropriate consideration. Mm-hmm. Director Patel, you're familiar with the Fifth Amendment.
Yes, Senator.
And it is really the freedom clause of the United States. It was 4 years into being a nation when Congress and the states said, hey, we have to make sure that there's not an over-aggressive government in the future that deprives us of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And you're familiar that that applies to all persons in the United States.
Yes, Senator.
So there's been a lot of concern about the several hundred immigrants who were swept off the streets of America and sent to El Salvador without due process. And does that concern you?
Senator, I'm not in a position to comment on whether or not they were given or not given due process or are supposed to be afforded due process. All the FBI did and all the FBI will continue to do is arrest those that have violated the law.
Okay, but to arrest, you have to investigate. Have you launched an investigation of this violation of the Freedom Clause of the U.S. Constitution?
Senator, I don't know that I agree with your characterization.
Well, that was my first question, whether or not you agree with the Fifth Amendment and are prepared to defend it. It is your job to investigate crimes.
Yes, I agree with the Fifth Amendment. I agree with the entire Constitution, and the men and women at the FBI decide.
So are you going to launch an investigation of the reported violation of the due process of several hundred individuals?
Again, Senator, it's not for me to call the balls and strikes on it. The men and women at the FBI who are trained to open investigations will make those calls.
So you have no influence over whether an investigation is opened?
I have influence over it, but you're asking me a constitutional question. I'm not a constitutional scholar.
Well, it's actually not it's a question also of law.
But your position is that every one of those individuals is by constitutional right afforded due process. I don't know the answer to that. I'm telling you.
You haven't read the Constitution?
It
says all persons.
I've got it right here, but what you're saying is that every single one of the illegals that was sent down to El Salvador is supposed to be given due process pursuant.
Yeah, that's what the Constitution says. It says no person.
It doesn't say that.
It does say no person. Yeah, I'll encourage you to read it because it's also been affirmed by the Supreme Court repeatedly. In the case of Miranda versus Arizona, held the right of all individuals, regardless of citizenship status, the Supreme Court in Reno versus Flores. I mean, but it's the plain language of the Constitution. It concerns me that you're not familiar with the core concept of due process applying to all persons as written in black and white in the Constitution.
As the first public defender who's ever served at the FBI as its director, I am more aware of due process than any predecessor in my seat. You are delineating between removal proceedings and criminal acts. My job is to investigate criminal acts. That's what we do.
You are aware that the Fifth Amendment refers to taking away liberty, and when people are arrested on the street, detained and sent out of the country, that their liberty has been taken away.
Senator, that is a constitutional question that you are asking me to answer. It's not for me to answer.
The question has already been answered by the Supreme Court that they're protected. Therefore, it's a violation of law, and it's your responsibility to open an investigation. And you're saying today you will not do so?
I am not the agency involved in removal proceedings. That is a different branch of government.
So if an agency other than the FBI violates the law and the Constitution, you will not investigate because it's a different agency?
I will investigate every violation of law.
Well, you have, but you just said you're not investigating.
No, you and I are in disagreement on what is a violation of law. I have yet to hear from the Supreme Court your position as you have adjudicated it.
Well, very, very interesting, because the Supreme Court's been very clear, and I had heard you were trained in the law, so I expected maybe you would try to uphold it. You also took an oath to the Constitution.
Thank you for the reminder.
Well, it's important to remind you, since you're apparently unfamiliar with the very basics of the core protection of freedom in our Constitution.
What I am familiar with is protecting the American public, and that's what
Let me
I'm
close
doing.
with one question, Mr. Chairman. Will you make sure that due process in every action of the FBI is completely honored under your time as director?
Will I ensure that due process is followed?
Yes.
Under the Constitution?
Completely. Send that message throughout the FBI that due process must be followed, is constitutionally required. Make sure that it's done under your direction.
Sure.
Great. Thank you.
Senator Murkowski.
Let's break this down. Senator Jeff Merkley, in what starts as a seemingly principled defense of the Constitution's Fifth Amendment, quickly turns into yet another desperate attempt by Republicans to muddy the waters, rewrite legal precedent, and whitewash the real agenda, which is mass deportation without accountability. But the real fireworks, they come when Merkley tries and fails to trap FBI Director Patel into validating his xenophobic narrative under the guise of defending liberty. This isn't oversight, it's political theater soaked in bad faith. Let's start with the false binary Merkley constructs at the top. So do you want us to add $1 billion for anti-fentanyl and terrorism work, or do you support a cut of $500 million? This is classic right-wing distortion. Oversimplify a complex, evolving budget negotiation into a gotcha game. Patel rightly explains, if Congress gives more, they can do more. Supporting the proposed budget doesn't mean opposing additional resources, but to Merkley, nuance is a threat. Why? Because acknowledging complexity would undercut the GOP's favorite talking point, that government officials are liars who can't be trusted. Then comes the real bait and switch. Merkley suddenly pivots to immigration, specifically referencing several hundred immigrants who were swept off the streets and sent to El Salvador without due process. Now let's be clear. If this happened, it would be a gross violation of constitutional rights. But here's the twist. Merkley isn't demanding justice. He's using this real concern as a political cudgel to try and embarrass a public servant who had nothing to do with the removals. Patel repeatedly emphasizes that the FBI investigates criminal acts, not removal proceedings, which are the domain of Immigration and Customs Enforcement. ICE, a separate agency under DHS. That's not ducking responsibility. It's a basic understanding of how federal agencies function. But Merkley doesn't care. He keeps hammering away with the same sanctimonious talking point. You took an oath to the Constitution. Here's where the whole charade unravels. Merkley, feigning outrage, demands that Patel investigate the deportation of illegals, yes, he uses that dehumanizing term, who were supposedly denied due process. But instead of going after ICE, who would actually be responsible, he targets the FBI director for not doing the job of another agency. This isn't just misdirected, it's willfully deceptive. Why? Because it allows Republicans to both pretend to care about the Constitution while actually defending policies that violate it, like mass deportations without hearings, raids without warrants, and family separations at the border. And let's talk about due process. Merkley tries to catch Patel off guard, asking repeatedly, do all persons in the U.S., including undocumented immigrants, deserve due process? But here's the kicker. He knows the answer is yes. He even references Miranda v. Arizona and Reno v. Flores, landmark cases that affirm due process for non-citizens. So what's the point? It's a trap, a disingenuous setup designed to either Get Patel to admit something Republicans can spin as soft on illegal immigration, or make him look ignorant if he refuses to play along. But Patel doesn't bite. He refuses to call balls and strikes on a matter that isn't in his agency's purview. And what's Merkley's response? Condescension. I'm surprised you haven't read the Constitution. The irony is off the charts, because while Merkley is waving the Constitution like a prop, it's his party that spent years shredding it in practice. Let's not forget, it was the Trump administration that ignored asylum laws, separated families at the border as a deterrent, and blocked access to legal counsel for thousands of migrants. Where was Merkley's righteous fury then? Let's also point out the glaring contradiction. Republicans love to scream law and order when it means militarizing the police or locking up protesters. But the moment someone invokes constitutional rights for immigrants, suddenly they become obstructionists, throwing procedural tantrums and inventing legal roadblocks. And speaking of obstruction, look at how Merkley manipulates language. He doesn't say people, he says illegals. That's not an accident, it's a tactic. It strips these individuals of humanity, and by doing so, justifies denying them the very rights Merkley pretends to champion. This is part of a larger pattern. Create a false narrative of chaos at the border. Use that narrative to justify police-state tactics, then deflect blame when those tactics go wrong. And when someone like Patel refuses to play along, when he insists on adhering to jurisdictional boundaries and legal integrity, they smear him as incompetent or un-American. Let's be honest, this isn't about justice. It's about optics. It's about feeding red meat to a GOP base conditioned to fear immigrants, distrust government, and reject accountability. The most outrageous part? Merkley ends by demanding a loyalty oath. Will you ensure that due process is followed completely by the FBI? Patel answers yes, and still Merkley sneers. Great. Not because he's satisfied, but because his entire line of questioning was never meant to get answers. It was meant to generate a clip for right-wing media that can be twisted into FBI won't defend the Constitution. That's the game. That's the propaganda. And it needs to be called out for what it is, a performance to erode trust, deflect blame, and demonize vulnerable communities. What we just witnessed was not a defense of the Constitution. It was a bastardization of it. Senator Merkley wrapped himself in the Bill of Rights while stomping on the very values it enshrines. He weaponized due process not to protect the vulnerable, but to entrap a public servant who refused to parrot his distorted talking points. And let's be clear, this is the GOP's entire strategy in a nutshell. They don't care about law. They care about power. And they're more than willing to pervert the Constitution into a weapon to wield against immigrants, government watchdogs, and anyone who stands in their way. Director Patel refused to become a pawn in their authoritarian fantasy. He stayed focused on facts, on jurisdiction, and on integrity. And for that, they tried to smear him. This is why we fight, because these manufactured moments of outrage, these deceptive hearings are designed to spread disinformation, sow division, and weaken the institutions that hold the line against tyranny. Don't let them get away with it. Don't let this twisted narrative spread unchecked. Share this video, expose the hypocrisy, and subscribe for more takedowns of GOP propaganda, lies, and fear-mongering. We're holding the line. Join us in the fight for truth and democracy.